On this Tuesday night, making face masks mandatory. The new rules in two major Canadian cities met with compliance.
I'm fine with it.
And resistance.
Protect your rights or they'll take your rights.
The next city that may force people to cover up their face. In his own words, the disturbing letter from the man accused of threatening the Prime Minister, a Global News exclusive. New blockage, a new U.S. court ruling that could make Keystone XL a pipe dream. And rising waters and a rising death toll, a torrential rain ravaging southern Japan, and going streaking through the sky.
Just when I thought it couldn't get any better.
A rare comet hurtling past Earth that has stargazers starstruck.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We're going to get to the mandatory rules on mask wearing in some cities in just a moment, but we begin with new insight Global News has learned into what may have motivated the man charged with uttering or conveying a threat to cause death or bodily harm to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. 46-year-old Corey Hurren, a member of the Canadian Armed Forces, was arrested after ramming his truck through the gates of Rideau Hall on July 2nd. He's facing 22 charges, and court documents reveal he had 4 loaded guns, including a semi-automatic rifle and a prohibited high-capacity magazine. Our Ottawa Bureau Chief Mercedes Stephenson joins me. Mercedes, it seems clear he had the capacity to do serious harm, and you have exclusive information about a note Hurren had with him. What does it reveal?
Donna, Global News now knows what was in the note that Corey Hurren wrote in advance of smashing his truck through the gates of Rideau Hall with a small arsenal of firearms. Hurren composed a 2-page letter in shaky and difficult-to-read handwriting, according to sources who are familiar with the document. The letter is a mix of personal despair and financial distress, combined with comments on COVID-19 and clear anger at the Liberal government. In it, Hurren begins by identifying himself and saying he is now likely considered a missing person. He apologizes to his wife, the military, and his other family and friends for the trouble he says this will cause and has caused, indicating he simply doesn't see another way forward that he can live with. He says that he cannot keep living in his current pain. Hurren talks about his business failing and doubts that it will ever recover even after COVID-19 passes. He talks about financial troubles too, saying that he believes he had to act now before his truck, the one he used to smash through the gates, is repossessed. He then goes on to criticize Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his government, describing Canada as a communist dictatorship, railing against new gun control measures and government spending, as well as Parliament not sitting. In the letter, Hurren reveals that he has emailed MPs with his concerns, but says they did not write him back. Hurren says that he cannot handle another year under what he calls house arrest with COVID-19. Hurren describes his actions as what he hopes to be a wake-up call or a turning point for the country. He says that he has loved his time being in the Rangers and in the military. He also reveals that he arrived here in Ottawa on Canada Day, and he laments that he went to the War Museum only to find it closed due to COVID-19. He reveals he spent time near the Artillery Memorial here in Ottawa. He was a member of the Artillery Reserves between 1997 and 2000. He signs off by saying he hopes he will be forgiven one day and that his children will understand. He never is specific in the letter, Donna, about what exactly he's going to do, but one source described the letter as sounding like the last one a person would write. We asked terrorism expert, lawyer, and former military officer Leah West what she took away from the information in that letter.
And I'm sure the RCMP and the INSET is doing to really kind of get a good sense of what this person's motive and intent was. It doesn't seem that he was able to clearly make that known through his letter. And it may be that he was motivated for a variety of reasons. And that's what it does sound like in the letter, that his motivations were not strictly political and that a lot of it had to do with his own personal grievances.
Mercedes, you've also heard from sources that Hurren communicated with someone in the military before ramming the gate at Rideau Hall. What have you learned?
Donna, sources say that Hurren texted his letter, both pages in terms of photos, to his superior in the Rangers before he crashed through the gates of Rideau Hall. And sources say that when his superior saw that text message, he called 911 and called the police to let them know what was happening, to be on alert, and he continued to provide them with information throughout the incident in the hopes of de-escalating the situation. Donna?
All right, Mercedes Stephenson in Ottawa, thanks. The advice over whether to wear a non-medical mask in public has been evolving through the many long months of this pandemic, and now Canada's largest city and the nation's capital have taken things a step further. It's now mandatory in Toronto and Ottawa to wear a mask in enclosed public places. The number of new cases of COVID-19 in Ontario is trending downward. 112 new cases were reported today, most in the Greater Toronto area, and the curve has flattened substantially right across the country. Clusters of new cases, when they happen, tend to be linked to enclosed spaces like nail salons, restaurants, meatpacking plants, and farms with migrant workers. Toronto's public health officer says making masks mandatory rather than just encouraging their use improves compliance. Mike Drolet reports on the rules and the response.
Back to normal. This was expected on the first day of mandatory masks in Toronto, a vocal minority protesting infringements on their right to freedom. But most everywhere else in the city, the non-punitive bylaw mandating masks be worn indoors was met with a shrug and compliance.
I think it's a good idea. Yeah, well, who wants to get corona, you know?
Should have happened months ago.
Yeah.
Months ago, maybe in February.
Over 50 countries around the world have made masks mandatory. In Canada right now, it's just 2 cities, Toronto and Ottawa, where the new bylaws give businesses the right to refuse service.
I'm allowed to?
No.
You're not allowed to touch me?
While also creating the possibility of more conflict.
It's unfortunate. I would like us to be more reliant upon individual responsibility, but it seems that is insufficient.
What's insufficient for Montreal retailers is how far the city's new mask bylaw, which goes into effect at the end of the month, will reach. Masks might soon be mandatory within Montreal, but all its suburbs have yet to follow suit.
We have to look forward for a regional, super-regional, or even provincial regulation on that issue. That would be way easier for everyone.
It's an issue British Columbia seems to be grappling with as well, where Provincial Health Officer Dr. Bonnie Henry has said she fully supports wearing masks indoors. She just has no interest at this time in making it mandatory.
It depends very much on your transmission in your community. So I do not believe we're at the point where we need to mandate it, and I don't believe we have been there.
And the numbers do support that. On the same day this week, BC had 7 new cases, Quebec 74, and Ontario 154. All numbers that pale in comparison to what we were seeing during the height of the pandemic. The COVID-19 crisis has become more of a regionalized issue, putting more pressure on local health officials and politicians to make tough and sometimes unpopular decisions. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
Wearing a mask is mandatory inside Toronto's Pearson International Airport, and the federal Conservative leader and the Premier of Manitoba are being criticized after pictures were posted on social media showing them without masks. Andrew Scheer and Brian Pallister were sitting with a group in the departures area. They were not wearing masks. In early June, Pearson Airport made wearing a non-medical mask mandatory for all travelers and employees inside the terminal at all times. Brazil's president refused to wear a mask until he was ordered to do so by a judge, and now Jair Bolsonaro has tested positive for the novel coronavirus, which he's repeatedly dismissed as just a little cold. Bolsonaro says he got tested after he began to feel unwell on Sunday. At one point during this news conference, he took off his mask and said he's feeling just fine. He also told reporters he's taking hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, and that he had an X-ray of his lungs that showed they're clear. Bolsonaro has come under intense criticism for minimizing the seriousness of the pandemic. He's called the virus a mild flu as his country's death toll mounted. Brazil is now the second worst hit country in the world after the United States. More than 65,000 Brazilians are known to have died from COVID-19, and more than 1.6 million people have tested positive. It's likely many more cases have gone undetected because of limited testing. That kind of rampant spread of the virus in Brazil is something officials in Australia are trying to avoid. As Crystal Gamansing reports, they're going to extremes to try to get an outbreak in the country's second largest city under control.
It's a pandemic, and it will kill thousands of people if it gets completely away from us.
It's a risk Australian leaders are not willing to take. COVID-19 infections in the state of Victoria hit levels not seen in months. To suppress the spread, a lockdown is being imposed on nearly 5 million people in Melbourne.
You know, it's like the iceberg analogy, isn't it? There's been a lot going on that we didn't know was there, and all of a sudden it's come to the surface and everyone's a bit freaked out about it.
199 cases were reported Tuesday. It may not seem like a lot, but it is for Australia. And infections are occurring through community transmission. For the first time since the Spanish flu, the border between Victoria and New South Wales has been closed. Only under special circumstances are people granted permission to cross.
This is, I know, further than we went last time, but we are in many respects in a more precarious, challenging and potentially tragic position.
In many countries, the pandemic is accelerating. Worldwide infections have increased by nearly 1 million in roughly a week. More than 200 scientists called on the World Health Organization to acknowledge the possibility the virus can be airborne, spread through tiny particles that linger in the air.
We acknowledge that there is emerging evidence in this field, as in all other fields, regarding the COVID-19 virus and pandemic. And therefore, we believe that we have to be open to this evidence.
As scientists continue to examine the virus and how it's most often spread, people are trying to stay virus-free. And for millions in Australia, that means staying at home. Crystal Gamansing, Global News, London.
The World Health Organization says it's sending a team back to China to study the origins of the novel coronavirus and how it jumped from animals to humans. The team will depart this weekend for Wuhan, where the first human cases of a mysterious pneumonia were linked to a local wet market. China's been heavily criticized for initial secrecy about the outbreak. The U.S. and President Donald Trump have been highly critical of the World Health Organization, blaming it for being too slow to react to the pandemic. For months, President Trump has criticized the organization, and now the U.S. is acting on its threat to pull out of the World Health Organization altogether. It's one of the biggest funders, and according to U.S. media reports, the Trump administration has formally notified the UN it's triggering the process to withdraw. It's expected to take 1 year. The U.S. is still top of the charts of COVID-19 cases in the world, and the numbers are surging in a number of states. More than 46,000 more Americans tested positive just today. That brings the total number of infections to more than 2.9 million. Here in Canada, the federal government has signed an agreement with the Assembly of First Nations outlining how it will fund the plan to overhaul the First Nations child welfare system. It's the next step towards implementing Bill C-92. That's the legislation that gives Indigenous communities control over child welfare and aims to reduce the number of kids in care. Not all provinces are on board. Quebec has launched a constitutional challenge to the law, arguing child welfare is a provincial responsibility.
Instead of wasting all the tax dollars fighting this bill, is to start working with chiefs and leadership to implement this bill. It's really in the best interest of the children. There's too many children in foster care under provincial systems. And we've said it this way, that you've got to focus on the children, keep them at home in their communities and their families.
The Assembly of First Nations estimates there are 40,000 Indigenous children in foster care across Canada, and that's more than double the number of kids taken from their families when residential schools were at their peak. Members of a House of Commons committee have agreed to look into why grocery store chains have cut pandemic pay premiums for workers. Union leaders representing thousands of grocery store workers say there's no reason to cut the premium since COVID-19 is still a risk for workers. Some have become ill and a few have died from the virus. When the outbreak struck Canada in March, major grocery store chains boosted frontline workers' wages by about $2 an hour. Late last month, the chains announced they were ending the pay bump because the pace of business has eased. A developing disaster in Japan coming up. What's in the forecast after widespread flash floods? Plus, pipeline pushback, the latest obstacle for Keystone XL. The Keystone XL Pipeline has suffered yet another setback. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected a request from the Trump administration to allow construction of parts of the Keystone XL Pipeline that have been blocked by a federal judge in Montana. The court upheld a lower court ruling, and as Eric Sorensen reports, after years of legal battles, that means the future of the pipeline is again up in the air.
This project is about Alberta taking control of its destiny.
Just days after Alberta's premier kicked off construction of the Keystone XL Pipeline, the mega project is stalled once again. From the U.S. Supreme Court, a non-decision thunderbolt, rejecting a bid from the Trump administration to allow Keystone construction that's been blocked by a Montana judge. The massive project would ship more than 800,000 barrels of crude from Alberta's oil sands to refineries on the U.S. Gulf Coast. The Canadian company behind the pipeline says in a statement, TC Energy remains committed to the future of this project. The court decision comes as a coalition of environmental organizations urges Ottawa to chart a new path away from oil and towards climate protection. The International Institute for Sustainable Development says billions of federal dollars that will be spent recovering from COVID-19 should come with green strings attached. For the carbon economy, support only for companies that agree to net zero emissions by 2050. For the new economy, stimulus to build a green recovery with green jobs. In short, this is no time for Alberta or Ottawa to spend billions on pipelines, says the report's co-author.
There's a huge risk that we're actually creating stranded assets instead of putting our money towards low carbon sectors where we know there's going to be jobs in the long run.
The Alberta government has maintained the economic recovery from COVID-19 needs Canadian oil.
It will only happen if we get pipelines built.
But the oil sector is struggling. Ottawa spent $4 billion on the proposed TMX pipeline expansion from Alberta to BC that several Indigenous groups still oppose. All this at a time when oil prices are low and some investors are pulling back.
As economic recovery unfolds, how much net new investment do we see in the oil and gas sector? So I think it's going to take several years for the oil and gas sector to get back to its pre-COVID levels of activity, given the dramatic economic shock that's taken place.
As for Keystone XL, Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden has vowed to scrap Donald Trump's approval of it, which means a project now stopped by the courts is uncertain to restart after November's U.S. election. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
Still ahead, a bus ride turns tragic for students in China.
You're watching Global National.
Crews in southern Japan are trudging through knee-deep water trying to rescue people trapped by flooding. At least 55 people have been killed after days of torrential rain and landslides, and at least a dozen people are missing. Over 1.3 million others have been ordered to leave their homes, and more rain is in the forecast through Thursday. In southwestern China, 21 people have been killed when a bus plunged into a lake. Video shows the bus suddenly swerve off the road, break through a fence, and then plunge into the water. The passengers are believed to have been high school students on their way to exams. State media says at least 18 people on board were rescued. United Nations investigators say Syria's pro-government forces and its rebel opponents flagrantly violated the laws of war during the battle for Idlib province. The new UN report says civilians endured what it calls unfathomable suffering and were subject to indiscriminate airstrikes, ground shelling, arrests, and torture when Syria's military launched its deadly campaign late last year. Hundreds of civilians were killed before a ceasefire was finally agreed in March. About 1 million people were displaced, and many have been forced to live in overcrowded camps. The early bird gets a magnificent sight. Next, how to spot Comet NEOWISE. The pandemic has a lot of us staying home, sometimes without much to do. But the universe is giving us a good reason to get up early in the morning to see what many are calling the most impressive comet in years. Mike Armstrong explains.
This is the Comet NEOWISE, as seen over Switzerland, just breaking over the horizon. That's its tail fanned out behind it. Now, stargazers had two other comets in 2020 they were looking forward to. Both turned out to be disappointments. That is not the case with this one. NEOWISE is actually brighter than expected. Here it is shot from Burlington, Ontario, in the sky over Toronto. It's small, but spectacular. This photo was snapped by an astronaut in the space station. This one by an amateur photographer in Lebanon. It's NASA's official astronomy picture of the day.
So about once a decade, you get one that is really bright, naked eye visibility. And that's what, surprisingly, NEOWISE has become. We weren't expecting it.
The comet is named after the NEOWISE spacecraft, the infrared wavelength space telescope that discovered it. It's been visible with inexpensive ground telescopes and even binoculars from the southern hemisphere for a while on its way towards the sun. As it's gotten closer, it's become easier to see from the northern hemisphere and brighter. It's rare that comets are so visible with the naked eye. So what is it? Well, comets are sometimes called dirty snowballs. They're ice and rock and dust. The tail is gas and dust blown off by the sun's heat and solar wind. The glow comes from molecules breaking down.
As it gets close to the sun, you heat it up, and that's what creates the tail.
Now, NEOWISE survived its pass around the sun last week. That's when most comets disappear. This one's still going. It's going to fade as it moves away from the sun, but not as quickly as usual because it's getting closer to Earth. The show will continue for several days. To spot it, look low on the horizon to the northeast. It's visible in the early morning now, but as it gets closer to Earth, it'll be earlier and earlier. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
And that is Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is Killarney, Ontario. Beautiful scene. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.